What if the imaginary friend you had as a child wasn't imaginary at all? What if they were the most honest version of a relationship you ever had? Stay with that for a second. There was a child. Maybe you remember being this child. Maybe you were 5 or 6 or 7. And the world, the real world, with its complicated adults and its unpredictable emotions and its rules that never quite made sense, felt like too much. So you found someone, not a real someone, not a someone with a body or a name that appeared on a school register, but a someone who was there, who listened without interrupting, who never got angry without warning, who never left without explanation, who understood you completely, immediately, without you having to work for it. Maybe you called them something. Maybe you gave them a personality, a backstory, a seat at the dinner table that your parents learned not to take. Maybe they went everywhere with you, whispered things to you, kept your secrets, made the dark feel less dark and the loneliness feel less total. And then, at some point, they went away. Not dramatically, not with a goodbye, just quietly, gradually, the way all childhood things recede, as the world demanded more of you, as you learned that having an imaginary friend was something to be embarrassed about, as you grew into someone who was supposed to need less. But here is the question that psychology has been slowly, carefully working toward answering. What exactly was that friend? And what does it say, not about your childhood imagination, but about something much more important, about what you needed, about what you weren't getting, about the specific shape of the hole that a child's mind will fill with extraordinary creativity when it is not filled any other way. For a long time, imaginary companions were treated as a charming but ultimately inconsequential feature of early childhood, a developmental phase, something children did and then outgrew. The research told a different story. Developmental psychologist Marjorie Taylor, whose work at the University of Oregon became foundational in understanding imaginary companions, found something that fundamentally changed how we think about this. Children who had imaginary friends were not, as previously assumed, more withdrawn or more confused about reality. They were more emotionally sophisticated. They showed stronger narrative ability, greater empathy, more advanced theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have inner experiences different from your own. The imaginary friend was not a symptom of deficit. It was a symptom of depth, of a child whose inner life was rich enough, complex enough, and hungry enough for genuine connection that they built the connection themselves when the environment could not provide it. And that distinction between deficit and depth changes everything about how we understand the child who needed an imaginary friend in the first place. Here is what is actually happening in the developing mind of a child who creates an imaginary companion. The brain, specifically the developing prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for social cognition and emotional regulation, is doing something remarkable. It is practicing the skills of relationship, the back and forth of conversation, the experience of being understood, the emotional safety of a connection that is, crucially, entirely within the child's control, because that control matters enormously. Think about what a child's emotional world actually looks like. They live in an environment of almost total relational dependence. Their comfort depends on adults who have their own emotions, their own stresses, their own limitations and blind spots and bad days. The love is real, but it is not always available, not always attuned, not always offered at the exact moment the child needs it. And children, whose nervous systems are still learning to regulate themselves, require something that a distracted, overwhelmed, or simply unavailable adult cannot always provide. Consistent, responsive connection. The imaginary friend provides all of this, without the unpredictability, without the conditional quality, without the terrifying possibility of withdrawal. The child does not have to earn the imaginary friend's affection, does not have to manage the imaginary friend's moods, does not have to be smaller or quieter or more convenient in order to be loved by them. The imaginary friend loves them exactly as they are. And for a child who has not yet found that consistently in the real world, that is not a small thing. That is everything. Now here is the part that most people never consider. The imaginary friend reveals something specific about what the child was missing. Not always in a dramatic way. Not always in a way that points to obvious neglect or trauma. Sometimes the answer is simply this. The child was lonely in a house full of people. The child had parents who loved them but didn't know how to listen. The child was sensitive in a family that didn't have language for sensitivity. The child needed to talk, and there was no one available to talk to without consequence. And so they talked to someone who was always available, who always had time, who always understood. If the imaginary friend was nurturing, a caretaker, a protector, someone who made the child feel safe, the child was likely seeking more security than their environment was providing. If the imaginary friend was adventurous, a companion for imagined journeys, a fellow explorer. The child was likely seeking more stimulation, more expansiveness than their real world offered. If the imaginary friend was simply a listener, someone to whom the child narrated their day, their thoughts, their small private observations, the child was seeking something achingly simple. To be heard, just heard, without judgment, without advice, without a distracted adult saying hum while looking at their phone. Fully, completely, generously heard. Pause for a moment. Think of Bing Bong from Inside Out, the forgotten friend fading away in the memory dump. That scene didn't make you cry because it was about a cartoon elephant. It made you cry because you knew exactly what it felt like to leave a part of yourself behind and pretend you didn't miss it, because this is the part that might land somewhere unexpected. Think about the imaginary friend you had, or the one a child you know has, or the ones you have read about, and think about what they were providing, because that specific thing, that precise quality of relationship, is the thing the child was not finding reliably enough in the real world. And here is the part that no one talks about. For many adults, far more than would admit it, some version of that relationship never fully ended. It just changed shape. The imaginary friend became an idealized inner dialogue, a running internal conversation with someone who is always wise, always understanding, always on your side. The narrative voice in your head that processes your day, that argues your case, that tells you that your feelings are valid when the real world seems indifferent to them. The capacity to create inner companionship, to construct, from your own imagination, a presence that soothes and understands and accompanies, does not disappear when childhood ends. It goes underground, and in some people, it becomes the foundation of their inner life. The writer who creates characters that feel more real to them than most people they know. The person who processes everything through internal monologue. The one who, when they are alone, does not feel quite as alone as you might expect, because they have always had a relationship with their own inner world that other people struggle to understand. These are not signs of something broken. They are the adult version of the same profound, creative, resourceful act. A mind that does not have enough connection on the outside learning to generate it from the inside. So here is a small, quiet ritual for you to try tonight. When you are lying in the dark, before the phone goes on the nightstand, say one sentence out loud. Not in your head, out loud. I'm here. Say it to yourself the way you would say it to a scared child in the next room. That voice that just spoke is the same voice that belonged to the friend you thought you lost. But here is the truth that sits beneath all of this. The imaginary friend, for all its creativity, for all its psychological sophistication, for all the genuine comfort it provides, is, at its root, a response to a need that should have been met another way. Not because imagination is wrong, not because inner worlds are insufficient, but because the child who needed to build their own companion was a child who was reaching, with the only tools available to them, for something they should not have had to reach for alone. Connection, safety, the specific feeling of being known by another person. These are not luxuries. They are, as decades of attachment research now confirm, as necessary to human development as food and shelter. The nervous system of a child who does not receive enough attuned, responsive, warm relational experience does not develop as fully or as resiliently as one that does. The imaginary friend was not just charming, it was compensatory. It was a child's nervous system, working at the edge of its creative capacity, trying to provide for itself what the environment had not provided. And that child deserves to be seen for what they were doing, not indulged, not pathologized. They were doing something remarkable. They were refusing, at 5 or 6 or 7 years old, to accept that the connection they needed was simply unavailable. They invented it from nothing, out of pure, determined, undefeated need. So where does this leave the adult who looks back at the imaginary friend they had and feels something? Not quite nostalgia, not quite grief, but something in the space between the two? It leaves them here, with the knowledge that the capacity that created that friend, that deep, resourceful, imagination-driven hunger for connection, did not go away. It is still there, still working, still doing what it always did, creating inner companionship, inner dialogue, inner worlds that are richer and more complex and more nourishing than the outer world sometimes manages to be. And the invitation, not the instruction, but the gentle, compassionate invitation, is this. Begin to examine what that inner companion was always providing. The safety, the attunement, the unconditional positive regard that Carl Rogers identified as one of the most essential ingredients of psychological health. The feeling of being known without having to edit yourself. And then ask, with curiosity, not judgment, where those things are present in your adult relationships and where they are not. Because the child who built a friend from imagination was telling you something true about what they needed. And that child is still in there, still reaching, still hoping that someday The connection they invented will be replaced by one they don't have to create alone. You for having an imaginary friend. You were never too sensitive, too withdrawn, too much in your own head. You were a child who needed something deeply, specifically, and urgently. And when the world could not provide it, you built it yourself. That is not a flaw. That is the most human thing I have ever heard. The goal was never to need less. The goal was never to outgrow the capacity for deep inner connection. The goal is to become whole enough, safe enough, trusting enough to let that connection exist between you and real people. People who have earned the version of you that only your imaginary friend ever got to see. The unedited one. The one that doesn't have to perform. The one that is, and has always been, more than enough. If this reached you somewhere quiet, somewhere you didn't expect, share it with someone who also used to live mostly in their own head. They'll know exactly what this was about. And subscribe to Psychology Space, because some truths take a lifetime to be ready for. But once you hear them, you can't unhear them, because the most important journey you will ever take is inward.